What if the American history you learned in school is only half the story? What if I told you that powerful African empires aren't just a distant memory, but are hiding in plain sight all around us, woven into the very fabric of the nation? How could a continent's incredible legacy be so completely overlooked? We're taught that American history kicks off with European settlers. But the real story is so much more complex and, honestly, a lot more interesting. The clues to this hidden history are everywhere in the food we eat, the music we love, and even in mysterious artifacts that challenge everything we thought we knew. For centuries, the story we've been told is one of discovery and colonization. A narrative that pretty much starts in 1492, but that version of history is missing some huge chapters. It systematically pushes aside the contributions, the resilience, and the lasting power of African civilizations and their descendants. So today, we're peeling back the layers of that official story. We're going on to separate but connected journeys. First, we'll explore the undeniable, tangible legacy of great African empires like Mali, Congo, and Songhai, cultural and spiritual empire that survived a brutal journey across the Atlantic and became a cornerstone of American identity. This isn't a story about victims. It's a story of unbreakable cultural power. Then, we're going to venture into more controversial territory. We'll look at the tantalizing and fiercely debated clues that suggest there might have been an African presence in the Americas long before Columbus ever set sail. We're talking about massive stone heads with features that have puzzled experts for decades, ancient maps that seem to show the impossible, and strange accounts from the very first European explorers. This is a journey to uncover a lost history, a story of empires hiding in plain sight. Before we get into ancient mysteries, we have to acknowledge the African empire that isn't hidden at all. It's so deeply embedded in American life that we often take it for granted. This is the empire of culture, brought to the Americas not by explorers with flags, but in the hearts and minds of millions of enslaved Africans. The transatlantic slave trade was a horrific tragedy, but it was also the vehicle for one of the biggest cultural transfers in human history. Great African empires like Mali, Songhai, Benin, and Congo weren't just collections of villages. They were sophisticated centers of art, science, and spirituality. And when their people were brought to the Americas by force, that culture came with them. It refused to die. Let's start with what you hear. The entire landscape of American music is built on an African foundation. Just think about it. The call and response singing, the complex polyrhythms, the syncopation, the blue notes, these are all direct descendants of West and Central African musical traditions. In places like Congo Square in New Orleans, enslaved Africans would gather on their one day off. They played music, they danced, and they kept their cultural memory alive. Those rhythms didn't just stay in Congo Square. They evolved. They gave birth to jazz, America's only truly original art form. They laid the groundwork for the blues in the Mississippi Delta, which then sparked rock and roll. Those same roots branched out into soul, funk, and hip-hop. Even the banjo, which many people see as a staple of Appalachian folk music, is a ghost of this African past. Its direct ancestor is the West African lute, recreated by enslaved musicians, a perfect example of African technology transforming American culture. So when you listen to almost any kind of popular American music, you're hearing the echoes of African empires. Now, let's talk about what you taste. The food on your plate tells a similar story. Many staples of Southern cuisine are here because of the agricultural genius of Africans. Crops like okra, watermelon, and black-eyed peas were brought from Africa. The entire rice industry in the Carolinas was built on the knowledge of people from Africa's rice coast who had generations of expertise in how to cultivate its expertise their captors desperately needed. Dishes we now think of as American classics, like gumbo and jambalaya, are the delicious results of this cultural fusion. The word gumbo itself likely comes from a West African word for okra. These recipes aren't just lists of ingredients, they're edible histories, telling a story of survival, adaptation, and the blending of African, indigenous, and European foodways. This cultural empire even lives in the words we speak and our spiritual practices. Languages like Gullah Geechee, spoken along the coasts of the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida, are Creole languages that mix English with words and grammar from West and Central African languages. They are living monuments to African heritage. In the world of faith, the diaspora created powerful new religions like Vodou in Haiti, Santeria in Cuba, and Candomblé in Brazil, by merging African spiritual beliefs with Christianity and indigenous traditions. These weren't just religions. They were ways to build community, hold on to identity, and resist in the face of brutal oppression. Even inside American Protestantism, the ecstatic worship, the ring shouts, and the experience of being filled with the Spirit can be traced back to African forms of religious expression. So, before we go looking for lost fleets or ancient artifacts, we have to recognize this: an African empire of ideas, sounds, and flavors isn't just hiding in plain sight, the ground beneath our feet. It proves that you can enslave a people, but you can't destroy their culture. That culture became a form of resistance, a source of power, and, ultimately, a pillar of America itself. Now that we've established that undeniable cultural empire, let's tune in to the whispers from a much deeper past. This is the controversial, compelling, and often dismissed evidence suggesting pre-Columbian African contact with the Americas. This is where the story gets really wild, where we step into a world of mysterious artifacts and ancient legends that go against the mainstream history books. We're going to look at 4 key clues that have fueled this debate. Our first clue is probably the most famous and fiercely debated: the Olmec colossal heads. Found in the lowlands of south-central Mexico, these gigantic stone sculptures are incredible feats of engineering, some weighing up to 50 tons. Carved between 1500 and 400 BCE, they're thought to be portraits of powerful Olmec rulers. But here's the mystery: many of the heads have features-full lips, broad, flat noses that many people believe look distinctly African. The very first archaeologist to write about one of these heads, back in 1862, immediately said its features reminded him of what he called the Negro race, proponents of the African contact theory. Like Ivan van Sertima in his book, they came before Columbus, argue these are realistic portraits of African visitors or diplomats who made contact with the Olmecs. How else, they ask, could these features be so specific? It is really important to be clear here, though. This idea is firmly rejected by mainstream archaeology. The overwhelming consensus is that the Olmecs were an indigenous Mesoamerican people, and the features are an artistic exaggeration of traits found in the native populations of that region. They argue there is absolutely no supporting archaeological or DNA evidence for an African presence in the Olmec civilization. Still, the visual mystery keeps the debate alive. Our second clue is a legendary tale about a king who traded his crown for the sea. Mansa Abu Bakr, II, a 14th century ruler of the Mali Empire. At the time, Mali was one of the largest and wealthiest empires on earth, swimming in gold. The story comes to us from his successor, the famous Mansa Musa, who told it during his pilgrimage to Mecca. According to the account, Abu Bakr was obsessed with the Atlantic Ocean. He believed it wasn't an end, but a river with another side. He first sent out an expedition of 200 ships, telling them to sail west until they found something or ran out of supplies. Only one ship came back. The captain told a story of a great current that swept the other ships away. Undeterred, Abu Bakr decided to lead an even bigger expedition himself. He supposedly gathered a massive fleet of 2,000 ships, gave up his throne, and sailed west around the year 1311, never to be seen again. So, did this massive fleet perish at sea? Or, as some researchers claim, did it actually reach the Americas? The story is fascinating, but it's just that, a story. It comes from a single historical account, and there is zero archaeological proof, no shipwrecks, no Malian artifacts, no skeletons to confirm the fleet ever reached the New World. Our third clue comes from the man himself, Christopher Columbus. In his own journals, he wrote down some curious things. During his second voyage, he said that the native people of Hispaniola told him about black-skinned people who had come from the south in large boats, trading spears with gold tips. This account is interesting on its own, but it gets better. Columbus was actually given some of these spearheads. He sent them to Spain, where they were found to be made of an alloy the natives called guanin. The mix was a specific ratio of gold, silver, and copper. Later, when Europeans made it to West Africa, they found that the exact same alloy, with the same name and the same composition, was being made in Guinea. To some, this feels like a smoking gun. But again, mainstream historians urge major caution. They argue Columbus's reference to black people is ambiguous and could have easily referred to darker-skinned indigenous groups from South America. As for the alloy, while the similarity is interesting, it isn't considered conclusive proof of direct contact. Our final whisper comes from another Spanish explorer, Vasco Núñez de Balboa. In 1513, while crossing Panama, his men supposedly encountered and fought a group of what were described as Ethiopians or African war captives held by a local tribe. This account sounds pretty direct, but, like our other clues, historians are divided. Most believe this is a classic case of misidentification. The Spanish used the word Ethiopian as a generic term for any dark-skinned people they didn't recognize. It's widely believed they simply met a darker-complexioned indigenous group, like the NG people of Panama, and described them in the only terms they knew. No physical or genetic evidence has ever been found to support an ancient African community in that area. We've looked at giant stone heads, a legendary fleet, Columbus's own notes, and a strange encounter in Panama. The clues are tantalizing, but they're also highly contested. What do you think? Is this just a series of coincidences and misinterpretations? Or are these the faint traces of a history that's been deliberately ignored? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're finding this journey as fascinating as I am, make sure you subscribe, because we have more secrets to uncover. Our journey so far has taken us through the distant past, but the idea of hidden African empires extends right into modern America, in a form that's maybe the most controversial of all. This brings us to the story of the Washita Nation. Led by the late Empress Verdiese, the Washita Nation claims to be a sovereign indigenous nation of black people who have been in the Americas for thousands of years. Their story is sweeping. They say they're the direct descendants of the ancient mound builder civilization that occupied a huge territory in the heart of North America, much of it part of the Louisiana Purchase. The Washita claim they are the original people of this land, and that their identity was erased, first by colonists and then by the U.S. government. They argue the name Washita comes from the Washita River and the original name for the people of that area. Their history, they claim, proves that not all black people in America arrived on slave ships. Many were already here. The Empress and her followers have produced their own documents, like passports and license plates, and have tried to file legal claims for millions of acres of land. This is the ultimate claim of an African empire hiding in plain sight, not as a cultural echo, but as a living nation today. However, this is where we have to draw a very, very clear line. The claims of the Washita Nation are not recognized by any federal or state government, period. Mainstream historians, anthropologists, and legal experts all agree that this narrative is not supported by credible evidence. Scholars categorize the Washita Nation as part of the modern sovereign citizen movement groups that believe they are exempt from U.S. laws. The historical documents they use are considered misinterpreted or fabricated. There is no credible evidence for a sovereign black empire called the Washita in North America. The actual Washita people were a Native American tribe from the Caddo Confederacy, with no known link to an ancient African empire. The story of the Washita Nation is a complex modern phenomenon. It speaks to a deep hunger for a history outside the narrative of slavery and a powerful desire to reclaim an identity. But while the story's psychological power is real for its followers, it's essential to separate it from verifiable history. We've journeyed through ancient mysteries and modern controversies. We've looked for empires in stone heads and phantom fleets. But maybe we've been looking in the wrong places. Maybe the greatest African empire in America isn't a lost colony or a forgotten kingdom. Maybe the real empire is the one that could not be broken, the empire of spirit, resilience, and culture forged in the fires of slavery and built by millions who refuse to be erased. This is the empire that is truly hiding in plain sight. It's an empire, not of land, but of legacy. It's the empire that taught America how to cook, how to sing, and how to fight for freedom. The agricultural genius that made the plantations of the American South so profitable wasn't European. It was African. The deep understanding of soils, planting cycles, and water management for crops like rice was carried across the ocean in the minds of farmers from empires like Congo and Mali. This wasn't just labor. It was intellectual property of immense value. That is an empire of knowledge. The fight for civil rights in America, the very language of liberation, is deeply connected to traditions of resistance born from the African experience. From slave revolts and the formation of maroon societies, communities of escaped slaves in the mountains and swamps, to the faith-fueled protests of the 20th century, the struggle for black liberation has always drawn on African models of community and resistance. That is an empire of resilience. American art and design are saturated with African influence. The abstract patterns in African American quilts, the bold use of color, the symbolism in folk art, all of these trace back to African aesthetic principles. This is an empire of creativity. This is the central paradox. The history of African empires is often treated like something that happened over there, totally separate from the American story. But those empires didn't just vanish. They were transplanted, transformed, and reborn here. They became a foundational part of American civilization. Yet, this is consistently downplayed. Schoolbook history often jumps from ancient Egypt to the slave trade, skipping over 1,000 years of brilliant empires in between Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Benin, Great Zimbabwe. This erasure isn't an accident. To acknowledge the sophistication and power of these empires would be to admit that the people who were enslaved were not uncivilized, but were the heirs of great civilizations. Were so and surses so with sirs, caress sen with so sens sipsen with sansen with fen with to some with on a sarcastic to gape terrasat to sips our da sick kai sissy case sick kick cock that's got that sit kick you sick da the what I call up a ma up we media safe and safe the deficit it would force us to rethink the entire American story. So the real shock isn't that a Malian king might have landed in Brazil 700 years ago. The shocking truth is that the cultural DNA of these powerful African empires is all around us every single day. It's in the beat of a drum, the flavor of a dish, and the spirit of a freedom song. This is the empire they can't debunk. This is the empire that is still here. We've uncovered a tale of two histories. On one hand, you have the tantalizing whispers of a pre-Columbian African presence, the mysterious Olmec heads, the legend of Abu Bakr II, and the cryptic notes of European explorers. While this trail of clues is fascinating and deserves open-minded curiosity, it remains on the fringe of accepted history, lacking the kind of proof that would rewrite our textbooks. But on the other hand, we have the undeniable, irrefutable evidence of a cultural empire that isn't hidden at all. It is the powerful legacy of Africa that was carried across the Atlantic and has become a fundamental pillar of American society. It is the music, the food, the language, the art, and the unyielding spirit of resilience that has shaped what America is. This empire, the empire of the unbreakable spirit, is not a theory. It's a fact. It is the legacy of kings and queens, artists and farmers, whose influence survived the unimaginable and continues to enrich this nation every single day. And these two stories, the debated and the undeniable, both lead to one powerful conclusion. The story of America is dangerously incomplete without Africa. The African presence on this continent is far older, deeper, and more influential than we're ever taught. Which leads to one final question. If the evidence of this profound cultural influence is all around us, why is this history still fighting for its place in our national consciousness?